Hello guys, and welcome to the 13th lesson in the Ruby for Newbies series. I'm Andrew Burgess, and this is for Nettuts Ruby Screencast series. And in this lesson, we're going to be learning how to test your Ruby code using the Rspec gem, the Rspec Ruby library. As you know, testing your code is very important, and we're going to look at how we can do that in today's screencast. So, without further ado, let's begin. As usual, we start here at the desktop, and let's pop open a terminal, which I've focused on the desktop as our current directory. And let's create a little project here. So I'm going to, we're going to make a directory called, we're just going to call this, actually, let's call it our library project. Because what we're going to do is we're just going to make a simple library example here. So I'm going to then cd into our library project. Okay. And what you'll want to do to begin is gem install rspec. Rspec. This stands for Ruby Spec. Spec is just short for like specification, which is just what we're going to be doing is explaining how our code should work in the specifications. And then we'll write the code and test the specs. And if they pass, then our code is working right. So we're going to be doing some test-driven development here, write our test to decide how our code will work, and then we'll write the code, and we'll have our working project once our code passes the test. So let's set up what we want here. We're going to have a book.rb. We're going to have library.rb. Let me make a directory here that's going to call spec, and in the spec directory, we want to have a book spec.rb, we want to have a library spec.rb, and we want to have a spec helper.rb. And there you go. I think that's what we want. So now I'll just open this here, and I'm going to drag this project right into BBEdit. Let me close a couple things here. And actually, let's just pop ourselves into Lion's full screen mode here. And we'll do the same here with BBEdit. Okay, let's begin. So let's start in the spec helper folder. The spec helper, not folder, I'm sorry, Ruby file. Spec helper is just a, it's kind of a convention. Well, as we'll see, actually, let me open library, or we'll start with book spec here. What we want to do is there are going to be things that we need, libraries we need to require for each of our specs to run. Now, you're familiar with writing a require statement to require different things at the top of your Ruby files. What we're going to do is we're just going to require the spec helper file, just like that, and then everything else that we need to require. So in both of these statements, we're just going to require spec helper. I have to put that / at the beginning so it knows we're getting it from our current directory. That's for Ruby 1.9. So now here in our spec helper folder, what are we going to get? Well, in here we're going to use require relative, go up to the previous directory, and we're going to get the book file. Require relative, we're going to get the library file, and we're also going to require the YAML library, and you'll see how this works later on. YAML is just like a text-based database solution, and you'll see how this works further on. So let's start writing our book specs. They're going to be pretty simple. Now, if you saw my recent tutorial on Jasmine.js for testing JavaScript, you'll notice some similarities in kind of the syntax here, and that's because Jasmine.js took a lot of cues from Rspec when it was being developed. So you'll recognize here as we begin saying describe, and we're going to begin by describing book, just like this. So in Jasmine we used callback functions. In Ruby we pass all our tests into a block. So this is the describe method, or describe function. We're passing book as the parameter, which tells it what we are testing. Normally this could be a string, or in this case we're just using the actual class, with the class name as our test, as what we're testing there. So what can we put in here? Well, tests are going to begin with it, and then they're going to have a string, and then of course do an end. But before we get to actual tests, we want to write a before block. Now we can write before blocks in two ways. Right now we're going to do an each. So before each, any code between in the block of a before call, when we use the each parameter to before, this code will be run before each test. We could also do before all, which will be run once before all the tests. So what we're going to do in here is we're going to create an instance variable. It begins with an @ sign. We have to do that so that this variable will be available inside each of our tests. And we're just going to create a book here. So we're just going to say title, author. We're just using generic strings here for now, so we know what we're going to have. Okay, so we have title, author, and category. Very good. And so our books, every book instance will just take three properties like that. They're going to be very simple. And so first, we want to describe. I'm going to do #new, just like that. Now this may look weird. You might say, well, isn't it supposed to kind of look like a sentence? You know, book it whatever. You know, like book it returns a new book object. Well, that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it here is using hash and the method name that we're going to be testing. And the reason you do this is because it can turn in the output that Rspec gives us in the console. It may look something like this: book #new. And this is actually a convention in Ruby, which would be class name hash method name. And I believe that's mainly for instance methods, although I could be wrong about that. But so any method that we can call on a instance of class, for example, in this case book, we can call the new method on book, so we can refer to that method by the syntax book #new. So that's just why we're calling this #new. And in here, and actually, you know what? I don't want to make this. I want to make this a describe block. So we're actually, instead of, well, then we'll put our it test in here. So we're going to say basically book new should do what? It takes three parameters. Actually, well, let's just say it returns a new book object. And we can say @book.should be an instance of book. Okay, so let's talk about this test before we write our next one here. What exactly are we doing here? Well, this may look a bit confusing at first, so let me add in the parentheses here so you can see exactly what's going on. So we've got our book object here, and we're calling should on it. Now, we could also, if we wanted to negate the test or reverse the test, we could call should not. Now, what do we pass to our should method? Well, we can pass any one of many matcher methods. In this case, it's going to be an instance of, and we're passing book as a parameter to be an instance of. So basically, if we don't use the optional parameter parentheses that Ruby does not require, book should be an instance of book, of the class book. The book variable should be an instance of the class book. Excellent. So doing this in the true test-driven development way, let's save this and go over to the console now and run this. So we have our Rspec gem installed, so we can just say Rspec and pass it spec, which is the spec folder. Hit enter, and we have an enter. What's the problem here? No such file to load spec helper. Okay, let me try. I think I may not actually need the / in this case. Let me see if that fixes the problem. I'll just clear this and run it again. Excellent. So we're still getting an error, but this time we're getting a different error. If you look here, we have uninitialized constant object book. So our test isn't running because we're not even actually getting to the test, because we're getting here. Actually, no, sorry, we are running the test. But when we come to book, it's finding this up here. Book doesn't even exist. And so the error is being thrown up there. So in the book.rb folder here, or Ruby file, we can just say class book end. And now if we come back here and run the test again, you can see that our one example ran. We have this one dot here, which to show that we ran one test, and that one test has passed. Excellent. So let's go back here to the book spec, and let's write another spec here. We're going to say it takes three parameters and returns a book. object. So that should be, now the thing is here, we're passing these 3 parameters and we got a book object back. But we want to make sure that it just takes 3 parameters. So what we can do is, or that it requires 3 parameters. So we can say, we're going to just create a new book in here. We'll say book.new title and author. And we'll say book.should not be an instance. And actually that should, of book. Over here, this should refer to our local book, not our instance book. And the reason book should not be an instance of book is because we should not get a new book object back if book only takes 2 parameters. So let's try running that. And this test failed. You can see here we have F. So book takes 3 parameters and returns book. It was expected not to be an instance of book, but it turned out to be an instance of book. So we have to correct that. Let's go here to the book library now, and let's create our initialize method. That should be a Z. And we want to take an author, actually no, we want to take a title, an author, and a category. And in this test here, we're just going to say title equals title, author equals author, and category equals category. So we're not providing default values for any of these 3 parameters, so that means all 3 of them will be required. So this test should pass now because book shouldn't be a book because we can't create a new book with just 2 parameters. So let's clear this, try this again. And okay, so we're getting an error here for the wrong number of parameters. We're getting an argument error. So this brings up something important. The problem here is that we're using the wrong test to test what we want to test. What we need to do is use a different matcher. We don't want, because book is not going to return an object. Book.new is not going to return an object. It's going to throw an error instead. So we should be testing to see if this code throws an error, not to see if the object is something other than a book object. And so the way we're going to do this is a bit differently. Now, well, what we want, let's write the test first. We're going to have something here. I'll just say something for now. Something dot should, and what we want is raise exception. And as we saw, that raised an argument error, so we actually don't have to put the parentheses there. Something should raise an argument error, but we can't call the method in the test because then the Rspec code can't check to see if the method has been called. So what we need to do is create a lambda. Now we haven't talked about lambdas yet, but don't freak out or anything. It's just basically like a function that we can pass around. That's really all it is. So what we're going to do is in here, we're going to say book.new title and author. And you'll see here, so basically we're saying when we run the code book.new, this should raise an exception with an argument error here. And this should raise the argument error. And if we come back here and run it, you can see now that we have 2 that are. So we should actually change this text here to make it more accurate. We'll say it throws an argument error when not passed, or we'll say when given fewer than 3 parameters. Okay. So we're not going to make this too comprehensive, but those are 2 good tests to start, and we can see how those are passing. All right, let's do 2 more, or a few more tests here. We're going to make these pretty simple. So we're going to say describe when we call hash title. We want it returns the correct title. And so basically all we want is that when we call title on our book object, we could say add book.title .should equal title. And let me just copy this. So notice that the matcher we used here, in this case EQL, which is just short for equal. There's actually we could, instead of this, use just the double equal operator. This equal is actually a method. This is an operator, which of course is a method too in Ruby, but in this case it looks more like an operator. There's another equal matcher in Rspec that's the full word equal. But this refers to being an identical object in memory. So this would say is book.title, is the string that we get back from book.title, the identical object in memory the title is. This string right here, which in case it will not be. So we want to use EQL or a double equal sign just to make sure that we're just kind of testing for, I guess you could say, similarity. We're not actually testing for exact equalness. So these are going to be author should return the correct author, which is author. And finally, we have category, which should return the correct category, which is category. So now if we come back to the terminal here and run this, we find we have 3 failing tests. We have no method errors on all 3 of them. So we don't have title, and this should actually be author and category there as well. I'm sure you saw that, but that wouldn't matter anyway because we still have 3 failing tests. So let's come here to book, and we can add these. We can make these accessible. As you know, in Ruby classes, you have to make methods. So we could do var title to just return at title like that, and then def title equals to set our new title like that, and that's what you have to do. But Ruby gives us a shortcut and allows us just to do add our accessor like this, and we want title and author and category to be our accessible, readable, and writable properties. And if we come back here, we can run our spec again, and now we have 5 passing tests. Excellent. There's actually a more convenient way, but we can't see when we have this just our spec, we can't tell what tests are passing. So what we can do is say -- format nested, and there we can see book new. We have 2 tests passing there, title, author, category. We can see exactly what's been passing. All right, let's go into the library spec now and see what we can write here for our library tests. Okay. So this one's going to be a little more complicated. We're going to do some things a little bit differently just for a change. We're going to describe a library object. And we're actually going to have 2 before statements this time. One is going to be before all, and one is going to be before each. So before all, what do we want to do before all? Well, we want to start by creating a library array, which is just going to be an array here. And I will spare you the trouble of watching me type this all out. So we just have a couple of web development books here that you might be familiar with. So we have this array. What are we going to do with it? Well, we want to write this array out to a file using YAML. So we're going to say file.open. We're going to open a file called books.yml. We're going to open it in write mode. And in a block here, we're going to say f.write, and then we're going to say YAML : dump. Now we use : because this is a module. YAML is a module. This is a module method. It's not really an object. And then we're going to say lib object, if I can spell that right. Right, so there we've just written this array out to a file, which is the format that we want to be able to offer to our library objects when we create them. So that's all we're going to do. We're going to do that once before all our tests. Now in the before each here, we're going to create a fresh library object, library.new, and we're going to pass it books.yml. All right. So let's write our first test here. We're going to describe the behavior that we should see when we get hash new here, or when we call the new method. And this is going to introduce a new block called context. So our first context is going to be with no parameters. And we're going to have a second context to be with a YAML file name parameter. So depending on whether or not we pass the new method a parameter, something different should happen. So with no parameters, it should have no books. So you can see how we're kind of forming a sentence here. Library object hash new with no parameters should have no books. And we're going to say, we're just going to create a fresh library object here. Library.new, and then we're going to say lib dot should have 0 books. Now, isn't that some nice syntax? The other way we could do this is should have lib dot books dot length dot should equal 0. So you can see what we're actually doing here is when we say have 0 books, we're checking the books array we're checking the length of the book array, books array. So we could say lib.books.length.should equals 0, but lib should have 0 books is a much more natural way to speak it. And that's the whole point, or that's one of the big points of tests, is that they should be easy to understand, as close to English as possible. So with the YAML file parameter, it should have 5 books. And actually, instead of saying should has, let's say it has 5 books. So I just want to change this up here too. We should use present tense. Instead of saying it should have, we should add. It's convention nowadays to write your tests in a more present tense, not saying it should have, but it has 5 books. So it has 5 books. We're going to just use the lib object that was created before this. And we're just going to say lib should have, that'd be 5 books. All right, let's run this again. In this case, we're just going to run specifically the library spec. And right away, we have 2 tests failing. Notice that when we have tests failing and we're using the -- format nested, we get this up here and say failed, first test failed, second test failed, and then down here we have the details. What are our details? Undefined local variable lib object in both cases. And that's because I called it lib array up there. Whoops. All right, so if we do that, they should fail again, but we should get different errors. Uninitialized uninitialized constant, it looks complicated, but in both cases, it's because we don't have a library class. Fair enough. Let's go here to library. We're going to have to require YAML for this file, so let's just do it up at the top. And then we're just going to say class library. And let's see, does that fix any of our problems? Probably not, because in both of these cases, neither of them have the method books. Okay, so let's do our accessor books. And we're probably going to have to write our initialize method before we get those tests to pass. So we're just going to, this is going to be a library file, which by default is going to be false. So we're going to set our lib file to whatever the parameter lib file is. And then we're going to set books to equal if at lib file exists. We're going to use a ternary operator here. Then we're going to say YAML load. We're going to load file. We're just going to say file.read at lib file. And I'm using parentheses here just to make it clear what we're doing so we don't make any mistakes. Otherwise, we're going to use an empty array. So now everything both those tests should pass, because if we have a library file passed, we're going to load it in with YAML. If we don't, it will default to false and we'll get an empty array. Let me show you what got output. This is what got output. This is YAML syntax. Basically, this is just an array of each of these, as you can see, is a Ruby object for a book. We have 3 parameters that we're passing in. There's a lot of stuff you can do with YAML, but since that's not the focus of our tests today, we'll just focus on what we've got going here. So let's run this now. We should see both of them have passed. Very good. All right, so let's write some more tests here. And you know what? This time I don't think we're going to need to. We're not going to put them in any describe blocks, in any secondary describe blocks. We're just going to put them right here at the top level. So we're going to say it returns all the books in a given category. So we have our lib object here, and we're going to say lib.getBooks in category. We're going to pass it the development category. As you can see up here, we have 2 books currently in the development category, 2 books in design and 1 in usability. And that, let's do it the other way. We're going to say length dot should equal 0. We could probably do lib dot should have 0 get books in category development, but because get books in category development is going to return an array, and actually that shouldn't be 0, that should be 2. But that doesn't read quite as well. We could just say library should have 2 books in category development if we wanted to name the method books in category development. We're just going to stick with get books in category development. I'll leave that there. All right, so let's run back here. Failing test right here returns all books in category failed. What's the problem? Undefined method get books in category. Sure. So let's come back in here. We're going to create a new method right here. Def get books in category category. And it's going to be very simple. We're going to use the select method on an array. So for each book, what we do, so the select method on the array basically just goes through every item on the array, and if the block returns true, then the item will be kept in the new array that we're making. If it returns false, it will not. So we're just going to say book.category equals category. So if the category that was passed in is equal to the current book category, then we will keep that in the array that select returns. So now our test should pass. Let me clear the screen again, run the tests, and yes, we have 3 examples passing with 0 failures. Great, let's write another test here. Let's say it accepts new books. So how we want to do this, we're going to say at lib dot, let's say add book. We're going to add, I'll use parentheses here just to make sure everything, say book dot new, and we're going to add designing for the web by Mark Bolton under the category design. Great. So now we've added that book. Now we should say get book designing for the web. And this may not be quite the right way to do this. Should be an instance of book. So this should return an instance of book. Now this might not be the right way exactly to do this because we're testing 2 different methods here, add book and get book, but because we're just kind of getting the flavor for how Rspec works, it'll work for us in this case. So again, let's run that, and accept new books has failed because there's no method add book. So def add book, and it'll be pretty simple. All we have to do is say books dot push book. And while we're here, let's write get book. We know it won't pass without this. Title. Now this is interesting. We have an array of books. There should only be 1 book with the title. So we're just going to assume that there's only 1 book with the title. We're going to say at books. We're going to use select again. This time I'm just going to do this in line. We can say at book. We're going to return. So here, see what we're doing here is we're saying return all the books with the title we passed in. And then we're just going to use the array method first because we're going to assume there's only 1 book with that title, which I think is fair to assume in our limited example case here. But select would return an array with 1 item in it. We want to return the actual book object, so we'll just say dot first. And now let's clear this. and run the tests. And now you can see why we do testing here, because we're getting a private method select called for nil class. So there's something wrong here. And as you can see here, we made a typo here where books, it should be books.select, not book.select. And so that's why I couldn't find that method there, because book at book isn't an object. Okay, let's try this again. And you can see there our tests are now passing. Excellent. So let's see, let's write one more test here, and that's going to be it saves a library, and this is going to be our most complicated test yet. So what we want to do is see if we can save the library to a file, restore that library from the file, and have the same library. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to create a new variable called books. We're going to say at lib.books.map. For every book, we're going to get the book.title. Now what map does, it basically, it iterates over each item in the books array, and whatever is returned from the block is going to be in that item's place in the new array. So basically now books is going to be an array of all the titles of the books in the library. So that's how we're going to do it. So we're going to call live.save to save the books. We're not going to pass it a parameter file name, although we could. We're going to make it so we can, but since we created the lib object with a parameter file name, we're just going to, it will default to using the same one. Then we're going to create a file called lib2, which is going to be library.new, and we're going to get books.yml. And actually, you know what? Just to be sure that it's a different one, let's save it, and we're going to call it our new library.yml. And so then we'll pass that in here, just so we're not using the same YAML file, just to be absolutely sure that we're getting fresh results. So then we're saying books2 equals lib2 dot books.map equals book.title. And then we're going to say books dot should equal books2. And since we're comparing two arrays like this, it's going to compare each of the strings in the array, and they should end up being the same. All right, so let's begin. All right, so let's go back to the terminal here and run those tests, and we can see it's failing because we don't have a save method on our thing here yet. So let's go ahead and write this method here. So we're going to say def save. We want to be able to take a library file, but we're going to default that to false. So we're going to say at libfile is going to equal either libfile, which is what we passed in here, or if that's false, it's going to equal at libfile, or if that's false, we're going to call library.yml. So there's three different possibilities we could have. If we passed one in here, it will favor that over anything else. If we initialized the library with a library file, it'll take that second. And if neither of those occurred, then we'll just use library.yml as the name. Okay, so I should notice here that if we pass one in here, notice that it takes over as being the library file for this library instance. We just kind of lose track of the previous library file. Okay, so we want to open the lib file. We're going to open it in write mode, and we'll use a block here. We're going to say f.write YAML .load. We want to dump it in this case at books. So we're just going to dump that books array, and there we go. Okay, so that should be all we would need to do to get this test to pass. Let's clear this, and it's not passing. No such file or directory. Out new file or library. Right, so if we come back here to library spec, this should be our new file or library. Let's just take a look at that. There you go. Notice it's probably identical to, it is identical to books.yaml, because I should note here, this is a good point in pointing out that when we say accept new books, that new book that we added will not be in our books array down here, because after or before each test, attlib gets set to a brand new instance of library. So this just basically resets our test environment after every test. Okay, so that saves it. Let's see, is this working now? And there you go, our test is passing. And there we have our passing tests. So that is a crash course in using Rspec. If you go to the end of the written portion of this tutorial, you'll see a few more matchers that you can use in your different testing. Hopefully I've shown you enough that you can actually do some work with them in the screencast. There's more in the end of the tutorial. Let's do our usually free Ruby resource. In this case, I'm just going to point you to the Rspec homepage, which is rspec.info. There's a lot of great documentation here that goes into very much depth on how you can create your own matchers and other things like that. There's also a little plug here for the Rspec book, which is a great book on behavior-driven development, Rspec, Cucumber, which is another testing framework in Ruby, and all sorts of other stuff. You might think when you buy this book, oh, I'm going to learn everything about Rspec. That is true. And I should qualify that statement by saying that I'm in the process of reading the book. So, and I'm finding it to be an excellent book. But it's not just about Rspec, and it's not just about Cucumber, and it's not just about testing in Ruby. It's all about the fundamental principles behind behavior-driven development. So I think you will enjoy that book if that's your kind of thing. And with that, I will leave you at the end of our Ruby for Newbies Lesson 13. This has been your Nettuts Ruby screencast. You can check out net.tutsplus.com for more Ruby screencasts and other screencasts. Thanks for watching.